Thank you. All right. I guess we can get underway. Hello, everyone. Good evening or morning, wherever you may be. I'm Hayden Smith from the New England Korea Peace Campaign, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's webinar, South Korean Democracy in Crisis. This is a joint webinar by Massachusetts Peace Action and by the New England Korea Peace Campaign, which is the New England regional chapter of Korea Peace Now grassroots network, a large coalition of Korean diaspora and of allies and folks in Korea are working to get a peace treaty to formally end the Korean War. We're pleased to welcome two very great speakers tonight to talk about the Yoon Suk Yeol administration in South Korea and its parallels with the military dictatorship era in South Korea between the 60s and the 80s. As several of you who have been watching the news relating to Korea may have seen, the Biden administration has been working very hard to build ties with South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol's administration. Back in April, President Yoon visited the United States. You might have seen him sing American Pie with Biden at the White House. After which he also visited Boston, where Massachusetts Peace Action and the New England Korea Peace Campaign joined several other groups for protests against him during his appearance at the Harvard Kennedy School. And also this past month in August, he was part of President Yoon came back to the United States to speak with Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida about the makings of a potential trilateral alliance, which will have profound implications for the ability to stop military escalation in East Asia. So it's clear that he's been a major player in some of the escalation we're seeing and some really big threats to peace. To dive into the official intro for tonight, since assuming office, the administration of President Yoon Suk Yeol carried out many actions that have undermined ongoing struggles for peace, justice, and democracy in South Korea, including expanding costly and provocative U.S. ROK military exercises, heightening tensions with North Korea, rolling back workers' rights, and threatening to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality. Harkening back to the military dictatorship era of the 1960s through 80s, the Yoon administration practically outlaws all labor union activities, grossly ignores human rights violations of workers, women, and various minorities, and above all, severely limits the freedom of press and assembly. Blinded by a push for a new Cold War in Asia, the Biden administration supports this far-right Yoon administration. Now, the point of tonight's webinar is to talk about some of the history of South Korea and what it can teach us about the current developments going on right now with the Yoon administration. And I think most importantly, how we can build stronger solidarity and better relationships with peace organizers in South Korea so we can present a united front for peace and against a lot of the abuses that have been going on against various groups in South Korea, including how we can build better relationships with labor, with the feminist movement, and many, many more groups working for peace. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for tonight. First, I'd like to welcome Hwang, who is an associate professor of practice in international studies program and a leader of the Global Korea Project at Boston College. His research centers on contemporary transnational and global Korean history with a focus on the topics of democracy, peace, security, and human rights. His first book, Human Rights in the Transnational Democracy in South Korea, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2022, offers the first account of the historical intersection between South Korea's democratic transition and the global human rights boom in the 1970s and 80s. He has begun work on a second book that explores Kim Dae-jung's thoughts, actions, and politics on democracy, social justice, and peace. So welcome, Professor Hwang. And I'd also like to welcome Shorock, who is a Washington-based journalist who grew up in Japan and South Korea. He posts regularly about U.S. policy in Asia at his website, the Shorock Files, and for many years, he was a correspondent for The Nation, and his work has been featured in Response to Statecraft, Salon, Foreign Policy in Focus, The Progressive, The New York Times, Interpress Service, and South Korea's Hankyoreh and New Sapa. Shorock is the author of Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Intelligence Outsourcing in 2008. And his most recent feature is 70 Years After the Armistice, the U.S. introduces a new trilateral alliance with South Korea and Japan that could keep U.S. troops in Asia forever. So we have two guests who have worked on some things that are really relevant to what we'll be discussing tonight, and it's my pleasure to welcome them both. So please give them a warm welcome, and I'll turn it over to Professor Hwang first.
Hello, good evening, and this is Hwang. And first of all, just thank you, Hayden, for introducing me. And I'd like to thank Professor Sing Yeol, who invited me to this invaluable opportunity and to meet the nationwide, deeply committed activists and intellectuals on peace and democracy and human rights. And also, it is really special. This event is very special to me because to work with the team Shorock, actually, who I really admire, and for his invaluable resource and his deep commitment to democracy and human rights from the early time of Korean democratization movement. So today, I would like to introduce some of the guests of mine, and like a book published last year that actually mentioned Hayden. And so can you see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So just the Korea, it's you can see this chronological dates. So Korea is turning into the 1960s, and then especially 61 with General Park Chung-hee, and turn for the authoritarianism as well as economic development. But this authoritarianism more deepened in the 1970s. So many people call that as a dark time of the history. But many scholars paying attention to highlight historical struggles to make democracy around this time toward the 1980s and until even continue to today. And today the title is South Korea Democracy in Crisis. So today is talk much more highlighting in the 1970s and historical time, but hopefully we can draw some critical insights for today's situations. But many scholars paying attention to the tensions between the state versus society, how they make the kind of contestations. But today, just I'd like to draw some new insights and a new perspective, highlighting about those who actually are offshore communities, and so those people, how they engaged with the Korean society to make the change as part of the world. So today's my argument is pro-democracy protesters in South Korea built transnational campaigns demanding social, economic, and political justice that challenges South Korean authoritarianism as well as U.S. code of policy. So I would like to highlight 3 points. So how local people, especially pro-democracy and ecumenical actors. So here is ecumenical means not only Protestants, but also Catholics. And although I'm not much highlighting in this part of Catholics, but anyway, then as well as actually those religious and the secular, how they're building up the solidarities. So first focusing on this, the local actors, how they appropriate the language of human rights for their protests, and how the human rights issues in local society become internationalized, especially in the U.S. Congress, not the United Nations. And then last one is to see the historical development of transnational contestation of human rights in Korea. So I not only highlight these pro-democracy and human rights actors' role, but also seeing the counter action programs managed by the Korean regime and the U.S. Administrations. So let's begin with the first part. So until the late 1960s, the language of human rights not much mobilized by pro-democracy actors, but by Park Chung-hee. So when he made the military coup in 1961, he called the coup as a military revolution, and also it is a way to realize human rights, especially from freedom from wants. And he ran the first human rights office in Korea, government office, and the programs. But he suddenly stopped in the 1972 these pseudo programs, and he began to speak Minguan. Actually, the term itself could be translated various ways, and people's power and the civil rights, citizen rights, various terms. But in this case, actually, we can assume that his understanding of the civil rights as under the Constitution. So he put all the people's voice under the Constitution of Yushin Constitution. That's very much underpinning his authoritarian rule. But until the late 1960s, there was people who is interesting about the democracy, and they spoke about civil rights. But they began to adopt the language of human rights as part of their protest repertoire and the practice. And when they were exposed to global human rights advocacy campaigns led by Amnesty International and World Council of Churches, two different campaigns. I'll explain one by one. But before that, actually, we need to be aware of what's the world circumstances that critically influencing the global shaping of human rights observes. And so decolonization is one, and then protesters are very much exposed to the new thoughts of global change, like the liberation theology and Second Vatican Council. And also lots of practice of protests occurred, even in the United States, civil rights and then anti-war, and then also 1968 protest, and also global order changing toward that time. Although East Asia is a little bit different from the other part of the world. Most of all, actually, global interdependence developing, technologically connected world, like world village or global village, such a concept, and also most importantly, non-state actors developing, and individuals and NGOs began to be intervening the international affairs as part of their agendas. And then like human rights organization, environmental groups, and these NGOs are developing. And the human rights is definitely emerging, and although it's somehow called it re-emerging since 1945. This is another subject that we can discuss. And then third world nations began to moving on for democracy movements like Taiwan and South Korea, and Chile. Chile is a special day today in history. So Amnesty International began from the 1961 campaigning the prisoner of conscience, but it actually took a special turn in the 1964 to initiate the global advocacy campaigns. So until then, it's a European nation and provincial and parochial and organization, but it's still like pursuing that global-wide campaigns. It maintained the two critical principles. One is minimalism, focusing civil and political rights, while as opposed to social and economic rights. And then second thing is the political neutrality or impartiality. So anyway, a member should not involve in domestic politics. And this principle actually very much somehow collide with the local actors' imagination and visions. So they are very much imagined when they heard about the prisoner of conscience, campaigns and anti-torture campaigns. So try to establish the local chapter. So photos are showing that the inaugural ceremony of Korea Amnesty Korea. But you can hear it in the center, the revered the ecumenical leader Kim Jae-jun. He called this it is a natural endeavor to build a global channel through which global voices conscience can get together deliver our outcries. So paying much attention to the global communities support of Korea rather than Korea's contribution. So Korea developing their own concept that's called double purpose. So advocating for locally as well as globally. So that tension continues. So, but ultimately, 1918 in Gwangju massacre happened. This chapter dissolved by Amnesty International. And what constitutes the approach is totally different. So you can see these questions they raised in the 1968 when they initiate the human rights global agenda. So what is happening to men? What should Christians faithfully understand and respond to these happenings? So they see the human rights as a political matter, and they were concerned with the injustice of the world from the point of view of the poor and the privileged, oppressed. So paying special attention to economic factors. So in order to actually in line with this, all the council churches and Korean National Council of Churches in Korea, it's a Korean leading organization, and they adopted new concepts like mission is a theological concept, and Sangyo, it's a mission of God, just actually providing this kind of concept. And this is a concept for the social campaigns for the social salvation, as opposed to the traditional concept of individual salvation, that's Jeondo. And also another concept is the field. So like those ecumenical leaders and like these laymen were called into go into the workplaces or field. That's actually the place for campaigns. And they also even adopt like as a way to making a social movement method, adopted the South Alinsky. And many of you know actually his community organization campaigns. So as the situation is getting worse in politically, and they actually initiated further of these campaigns. So in November 1973, along with the World Council of Churches guideline, the Korean community held the consultation for human rights, and they bring all the demands of each field into human rights claims. So you can see these like freedom of academia, women's rights, minimum wage, and these demands actually represent what they felt and with the human rights and what they imagine, what they want to do with the human rights language. So this format is a real critical repertoire. So many of series of human rights declarations and events and developed during the time of democratization movements and also afterwards. So also these demands were publicized locally and globally, and with the like critical solidarity movements of transnational, ecumenical, also secular members of the movement, like just Peace Corps, Fulbright scholars, and so it showed that the secular and religious solidarities. And then the Taga is in Tokyo. It's to translate all local vernaculars into international languages. And also definitely North American College for Human Rights in Korea, and established in 1975. Actually, Mr. Tim Shorock is involved in the 1980s, and he will talk more about this. So let me turn to the next stage, how does Korean human rights issues internationalized? So internationalized human rights is developing in a very much dark time, that is under like emergency decrees. So Park Chung-hee to put pressure on those who calling for the revision of the constitution, and he initiated the emergency decrees. And then he put the suppression of student activism, and those also case called the People's Revolution Party. So it is very much unprecedented crackdown. And then the elderly, like the elder, the Quaker Hwang called this movement actually as how this serious movements, but human rights becoming a new meaning to this whole society and giving a new eyes to see this case as a critical global issue. And in this context, two critical mode of the activism developed. One is the politics of facts, and the other one is politics of testimony. So let me further on this. But these campaigns with the special consideration to the geopolitical and realist orientation. That is very much contrast to the general public's understanding, often like human rights activists as idealists. No, they are very much realist and then geopolitical perspective. So before we go into that, actually, what happened in the United States, especially U.S. Congress, and U.S. Congress. So United States built up its hegemony since 1940s, and with a special mechanism of national security state framework. And in which actually these all like U.S. military bases were critical, pivotal kind of machineries to building up this. Someone called it as archipelago empire. That's Bruce Cummings' term. But so also security, national security agenda was quite dominated by the very selective, unelected figures and focusing on national security. But this around the time in the early 1970s, national congressmen and members of the U.S. Congress wanted to revise. And then those called actually liberal internationalists, including Donald Fraser of Minnesota. And so they put building on this, the U.S. foreign policy in terms of human rights records and building up the global leadership and continuously institutionalized. So in 1974, Amnesty International delegate William J. Butler is prominent lawyer, and he came to Korea to investigate the 54 prisoners and about their issues of torture and their issues of like suppression, and very much historical term. And actually, he is in the middle of the image. He's at the center on the bottom. And so he bring that issue not to the U.S. Congress and United Nations, but to the U.S. Congress. That is very much a revised version of instruction given by Amnesty International. So he actually was called to the singularly rely on the United Nations, but he brought this to U.S. Congress. And also he revised another that's not like political neutrality stand, but he paying attention to geopolitical issues. So he testified to that is the U.S. should seriously consider withdrawing their support. So, and just he is touching on the issues further in U.S. military base issues. And in fact, he sent his report to the United Nations too, but no response. And Amnesty International sent another in 1976, but only United States nations are saying that they will confidentially study the situation in Korea without any prompt action. So, fact by the mission, some of you know about George Ogle, and then, it's an honorable missionary. And he made a very truly committed action together with a missionary group called Monday Night. And so he was kicked out, expelled from Korea, and it's very much unprecedented. And where did he go? U.S. Congress. And to testify his situation. That's actually William J. Butler opened up with his report and first human rights hearing. So, and then also anti-torture in 1975, another fact-find mission by Amnesty International and mission report. But in as a counteraction that I mentioned that earlier, so it's parallel developments. So again, the U.S. administrations and the Korean regime that's led by Park Chung-hee were not passive actors. They were very active to maintain Cold War security consensus. And so they initiated a new policy. And then that's quiet diplomacy. Actually, they put detailed, and they made a counter arguments. All of the like campaign led by international liberal internationalists. And then they issued this special report on the first day of human rights hearing in 1974. And so they're saying that the quiet diplomacy is better, but in essence, the quiet diplomacy means releasing symbolic figures, and like Kim Dae-jung, and then again and again, and then bring the good records, and then State Department say, "Oh, Korea conditions improved, thereby we can offer the military and economic aid." But it's a status quo or worse in terms of institution. So that actually, this kind of practice continues from the Ford, Carter, Reagan, and yeah, perhaps you are not surprised by the why I include Carter. And so first movement developing in November 1974. It is very much unusual, unprecedented again. Moment those local and transnational actors made a protest anti-U.S. President visit to Korea. And so in this context, the Kissinger bring out the idea about quiet diplomacy. So she suggests in a few days before the summit, I will meet Park Chung-hee, and then gives a signal about quiet diplomacy. So this is the 1976 is March 1st movement. It is very much an epitome of quiet diplomacy and human rights protests developed into transnational disputes. And it is actually these images showing that the ecumenical, that means Protestant and Catholics get together to make a transnational protest. And that happened several months after the emergency decree number 9, the most suppressive institution. And the Carter carried the whole idea of quiet diplomacy. And so labor disputes also developed. It's 1978, and then those workers in the Dongyal textile, and then claimed for the fair union election in improving working conditions. But actually, the gangsters come and then throw human excrements. So they made a protest through the transnational solidarities, but ultimately showed that the Cold War conflicts, including U.S. AFL-CIO as a Cold War machinery. So, just these kind of maintenance of the status quo by the states would not be coming without consequences. So people began to aware of what's the role of the U.S. foreign policy. And then ultimately, it is just kind of prioritizing Cold War security while sacrificing all democracy. But people's building up their furthermore solidarities to bring the issue to the international communities and building up further transnational solidarities. So in the 1980s, and after Gwangju massacre, that actually showing that the ultimate momentum, people's clear understanding of the U.S. role of the U.S. foreign policy and intent of the Korean regime, and their connection, that actually specialties of Mr. Tim Shorock, and I will put him on this issue. But ultimately, Koreans building up, developing their 1987 movement. And then 10 years later, Kim Dae-jung was elected as president. And that's another critical momentum in the Korean contemporary history. And so this kind of developments, local and transnational and solidarities for human rights and justice continues today. And those local and transnational actors are really defining and redefining the boundaries of solidarities and on the issues of local international affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hwang. It was a fascinating history that you were sharing, and I'll be eager for the Q&A. But for those who just joined us or joined us a little bit late, if you missed any of Professor Hwang's portion, this has been recorded and it is also being streamed on Facebook right now. So you'll have an opportunity to catch up later. And if you have any questions, we'll have a Q&A portion later in the hour. But before that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Tim Shorock.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm going to put my slides up. There we go. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and for Ingu for his great talk. I just want to say that I'm talking about the South Korean democracy in crisis in context of the past and the present. And part of it's a personal discussion for me because I was part of this movement that he is talking about, that Ingu was just talking about, but I got into it because, I happened to grow up there and I happened to be there at a very crucial time in Korean history. My parents were in South Korea. My parents went to Japan right after World War II. My father was a church relief administrator, and we lived in Korea after the Korean War. And so, here in this first slide, I talk about my opening to my eyes were open. If you can change the slide, my eyes were open to. See, can I change these? Okay, my eyes were open in April 19 when there was a revolution against Syngman Rhee. And I was really amazed by this. As you can see in the next couple of slides, I was there clipping out the newspapers and I was watching very closely what happened. And I was really amazed to see people rise up and kick out a dictator. At the first time I'd ever seen that, and that made me understand what the word revolution meant. And then, but as I, was watching this next slide, let's see, can I, okay. As you can see here on the, this was a revolution, but they really hated Rhee and his anti-communist, repressive regime. And this building on the left here, a pro-government newspaper, and the building on the right was the anti-communist center. So, people really vented their animosity at places that they felt had been responsible for the repression. But what amazed me in the next couple of days of watching this was the censorship in the newspapers. I'd never seen military go in. Can you go to the next one, please? Can I get the control? Maybe I can do it. Anyway, like you can see here, they're blotting out some of the numbers of police killed here. And then in the next couple pages, you can see just massive censorship. And I never seen this before, and frankly, I've never seen it since. I've seen in the 80s, I saw a South Korean edition of Time magazine where censors had cut out entire pages, but I'd never seen them go right into the newspaper and do this. So I was, kind of amazed by the whole thing. But it really, April 19th, I never forgot it. And my father was a witness right there, and we knew a lot about the repression of Syngman Rhee. And so for me, it was a real, turning point in my life was what happened there. Click to start. Okay. Let's see. Anyway, the other thing, of course, was the Korean War. We were there because Korea was devastated by the Korean War. And as you can see here, I was there in 1960. I was just there a few weeks ago in 2023, almost exactly the same place. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice, but it didn't end, and it's basically, still going on. And then, next, for me, I'd always thought that, we were the good side, there was the bad side, the bad communists. But if you look at movies these days about the Korean War, old movies about the Korean War, it's just unbelievable propaganda. This was a very popular film in 1952. And, Americans had been accused of strafing columns of refugees. And so they made a movie to justify it. And they would justify it by saying, in these columns were people like this with a machine gun holding them to the refugees' backs. So it was, this is kind of the issue was, American soldiers didn't know who was an enemy and who wasn't. But there was huge numbers of civilian casualties. And then, the other thing that was little known, and this is very important for today, is that next slide, the war was fought from Japan. The U.S. bases in Japan were used to bomb mostly North Korea, but they also bombed South Korea. So, Japan was an integral part of the war. And then, as you see in the next slide, after South Korea was democratized in the, in the late 80s, early 90s, and after, scholars started looking into what really happened. And there's been numerous books in the last few years that have really, people have gotten documents and pictures from the National Archives where a lot of these things are stored. And, there was massacres by the Sigmund Rhee regime in 49 and 50, where, upwards of, the estimates are hard to know, but, at least 100,000 civilians were executed before the Korean War actually started. In other words, before the North Koreans crossed the line and invaded North Korea, there had been about 100,000 people killed. So it was huge. And then, when Rhee, as it shows the next slide, when Rhee was overthrown, there was a period of democracy where people were thinking, oh, Korea can now be we can have an independent state, we can have a neutral country, and people were also beginning to press for justice for these people who'd been massacred. But when Park Chung-hee did his military coup, and then surprisingly in the name of human rights, all this kind of discussion stopped. And no talk of unification. Instead, he instituted this, rapid export-led growth. And I just want to, shift to Japan for a minute. With the war being fought from Japan, people in Japan were really getting upset about the U.S. use of its bases in Japan to make war on Korea. And in 1960, when the security treaty with Japan was renewed, there was these biggest demonstrations almost in Japanese history until the next renewal 10 years later. But this was largely aimed at solidarity with Koreans, because Japanese knew that their bases had been used for this war, and people were turning against the U.S. making use of Japan in war. And then in the next slide, this continued into Vietnam, and this is where I got very involved. My father got very involved. There he is in the very center there. He organized this demonstration with his students. He had a class on Vietnam. In '68, we marched against the U.S. war at the embassy in Tokyo. There's me there in a tie on the right. And I went back to college, and then I got involved in the anti-war movement after that. But as you see in the next slide, the leaders of the anti-war movement in the U.S. after the war ended were talking about bring the war home. And in my view, this was I understood why people were saying this. it was important to correct, what had happened in the U.S. that would bring us to, make war on a country like Vietnam. But it was really a problem because it meant the U.S. left sort of turned its back on Asia and left it up to the military-industrial complex and the right to define our relations with Asia. And so I'm going to have some critique here, and my critique is not of the people that worked in solidarity. My critique is of the American left and elements of the American left that lost the sense of solidarity. As in 1980, and then in the next slide, I taught another big turning point for myself was the Gwangju uprising. I was following it from the moment it happened. I was in Gwangju about 9 months later. But very few, because Americans had turned inward after Vietnam, and especially the left. And so there wasn't, even though during the 70s there had been a lot of attention on human rights violations in South Korea, it was mostly the churches and within Congress where the issue was taken up. But there was no anti-war movement in Korea to support Korea. And so Gwangju happened, and there was very little response from the American progressive movement or from even the anti-war movement. The next slide shows, there was great solidarity from the churches and, from, this Japanese left who had been organizing against the war. And, they put out huge amounts of material. But that was really missing in the U.S., except for, as you can see here in the next slide, some unions were really on top of it, and they understood there was a connection between, repression abroad and the denial of labor rights and American companies going to places like Taiwan or South Korea where unions were not free to organize. So, there was some people that really, caught on to this. And we can skip to the next slides. I had a couple of, we formed an organization called the Korea Support Committee in '81 that was really a broad-based group. Just wanted to give you an example of, we had trade unionists, we had church people, we had journalists like me, there was rank and file workers, there was all kinds of people in this committee, but that's what we did. We did education and support. The problem was, when repression really got bad in Korea in the 80s, the AFL-CIO, the U.S. Labor Federation, had a terrible record of, working with the U.S. government in Korea and other places, basically to make sure that unions were not leftist or anti-American. And so they chose to work with really reactionary trade unions. Next slide, please. And then this one, I had an article in The Nation. Next slide. I had an article in The Nation, which I've been reposting today because mostly it was about the AFL-CIO in Chile in 1973 and 9/11. But the Asian American Free Labor Institute, which worked closely with the CIA, and they worked with the most reactionary, pro-government and CIA-influenced union federation in Korea. And they had their close ties with this organization. And it meant that the real struggles of Korean workers did not get out to American workers. It was really a tragedy that this happened. And a black mark, on my view, on the AFL-CIO and unions in general. And then in the next slide, the kind of union solidarity with Korean workers and what they're going through and the problems in a militarized, divided country meant nothing to people that were like fighting the Korea Free Trade Agreement a few years ago. This was the most reprehensible campaign I have ever witnessed. I say that, truthfully. It was a vicious campaign. Public Citizen, Ralph Nader's organization, and the unions took on the free trade agreement with red baiting and this kind of militarism, like it's going to hurt our national security because we're going to fund, North Korea through this free trade agreement, through this zone, which was an industrial zone in North Korea, where South Korean companies invested, and North Korean workers worked on making clothes and garments and electronics and stuff. But the unions and the public interest groups could not understand that this was a key part of Korean unification, and that this industrial zone was the very last. This was created when they had the first meeting between Kim Dae-jung and the North Korean leader. And, this was a very important part of unification. And the Korean unions supported having goods from this in trade, but the unions didn't, and the public interest groups did not. And you can go to the next slide, and they really, it was, to me, it was just, it was, and showed you how little unions understood the reality of Korea, and all they just saw it through Cold War eyes. That was it. Whatever's good for national security is good for the American unions, and it was really a shoddy campaign. And I just think this is not the kind of solidarity that anyone needs. Now we can go to the present. We mentioned at the beginning, President Biden, who calls himself the most pro-labor president in American history, has now linked up to be a close ally with the South Korean president, who's probably the most anti-labor president in Korean history. One of them, anyway. Can you go to the next slide? They've created this trilateral alliance. They don't call it an alliance. They say it's a partnership, but it's really an alliance. They've been trying to create this for years and years, as I've been writing. But if you go to the next slide, I have, this came about because of two things that happened. First, last March, Yoon, the president of South Korea, went to Japan to meet with Kishida, and they've been having, years of dispute over possibly, how to compensate Koreans who'd been exploited by Japanese, companies exploiting slave labor during World War II. And the deal that Yoon made with Kishida was Japan pays nothing. Japan pays, no reparations whatsoever. It's all borne, the costs are all borne by South Korea. This is what's really angered people in South Korea. And Biden and Blinken call this a really outstanding diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. It's garbage. That agreement is a terrible agreement. It's a complete sellout. And there's been lots of demonstrations about it. And if you go to the next slide, you can see, people are also about a day or so after they met at Camp David for these meetings, Japan started dumping its nuclear radioactive water in the ocean. And that's also sparked a lot of protests. And of course, Yoon and, our ambassador and all these people are going to, eating the Fukushima fish to show how safe it is. And they're siding with Yoon. They're siding with Japan on this. So, in Korea, this is really seen as a sellout. And frankly, the next president runs, I guess, in 3 years, he could, Yoon could lose then, and this thing could be thrown out. So I don't know. Biden seems to think this trilateral alliance is going to last forever, and they're trying to make it so. But I seriously doubt that's going to happen. If you can go to the next one. I can't control the screen here. I can't seem to do that. Okay. And here I have, the other thing that in Kishida earlier in the year and last year also, they have this new military doctrine where the Japanese forces can now legally, under their new law, launch a counterstrike on another country if Japan is attacked or threatened. That's never been in law before. It's the first time since World War II they're going to have the ability to attack another country. But this is, again, has been pushed by the Pentagon for years. And I left out some of the slides showing that, but this has been something going on forever. The other thing that Yoon has done, and this is, to me, is really a kind of outrageous, is if you go to the next one, he has, the South Korean military and this right-wing government of Yoon are now kind of rewriting history, and they're condemning Korean independence fighters in the 20s and 30s because they later became communists. These are people who've been honored for years. On the right, you can see one of these independence fighters who was his body was brought back from Kazakhstan a few years ago, and he had this honor guard and everything. And on the left, this General Pak Sun-yup. He was a big hero during the Korean War, but in the 30s and 40s, he fought with this notorious Japanese special force of the Manchukuo Imperial Army, hunting down Korean independence fighters. And I note here that President Obama, when he was president, gave a speech in which he praised this general to the skies. And the Pentagon has even named a building after him at their base in South Korea, their big base. So the very last slide here, I talk about, it's crisis of democracy. I feel it's also a crisis for us, for our democracy, because, this is something, this trilateral partnership, whatever you want to call it, is something that the Pentagon especially has been pushing for decades. And in Korea, it's only possible under this pro-Japanese right-wing militarist. The previous president, Moon Jae-in, was much more independent, and in this he had support of his people. Second, the empire of bases that confronts China and North Korea is only possible with the U.S., what I consider an inhumane military occupation of Okinawa, where the people from the governor on down want U.S. Marines out of there. And now it's going in the opposite direction because of the threatened war with China. Okinawa is being built up again. When I was there in April, I had an interview with the vice governor of Okinawa. And he asked me, is the U.S. going to occupy us for a century? No other country has been occupied for that long. And I think, to really be in solidarity with in this crisis of democracy in South Korea, and I think it's a crisis of democracy in Okinawa too, we need to, help and support activists and people that are striving for sovereignty by pushing our own government to get the Marines out of Okinawa and to not be so militaristic in its approach to North Korea, and to support, engagement and to support a peace process. But that takes really, understanding from their perspective what the situation is. And I think, that's really important, is just to get, people to people exchanges and go over there and meet with, Japanese and Korean and Okinawan activists. And, there's been some of that increasing in the last few years, but I think that's crucial if South Korea is going to get through this next period, which a lot of people are deeply concerned about, because they fear that Yoon could use harsher tactics in the past. My only thought is that I think the South Korean people will never, ever stand up for another military coup, and that can never happen again. But you could have more repressive measures adopted by a government, just as we've seen in the United States. So, I think it's really important to keep on top of what goes on there, and try to understand it from their perspective. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was an extremely comprehensive presentation, and you also sharing your personal perspective is very powerful. I guess I'd like to please everyone give your thanks to both Professor Hwang for giving a superb presentation on how to wage trans and national struggle for human rights and democracy, and to Kim Shorock for speaking about the various forms of solidarity and over the course of history in Korea, and where we in the U.S. Can play a role. I hope that these lessons in history were useful to all of you, and I can speak at least from some of the people in the chat saying that this was very informative. So thank you both. I know we're running a little bit tight on time, but I would like to open up the floor to questions. So if you have any, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and I will read it out. Otherwise, in interest of time, I can just immediately dive in. I see, Al, you have your hand raised. So if you have a question, feel free to go ahead.
Yes, thank you for this great presentation today. And I want to ask Tim a question, if I may. In the slide, you wrote that the Carter administration actually aided the massacre in the Gwangju massacre. Was it actually an active aid, or did they just turn the blind eye and look the other way?
Well, I've written a lot about this, and you can, I can, if you email me, I can send you links to some of the pertinent articles on this that I've written. But essentially, there was a massacre on May 18th to May 21st, 1980, where Korean military paratroopers killed hundreds and hundreds of people in the streets of Gwangju. At that point, there was a meeting of the national security, and the U.S. knew that the killing had been done by this general named Chun Doo-hwan. The U.S. knew it was his responsibility. The U.S. knew that the uprising that happened after all the killing was the result of this military atrocious attack on the people. But at that point, the U.S. decided, Carter administration decided that this was a national security threat to the United States, and they agreed to help what happened was the citizens of Gwangju took up guns and kicked the army out of town, and the army cordoned off the city. During that period, they tried to negotiate. They even tried to negotiate with the U.S. ambassador, but the U.S. had decided by then that this was a national, it was a security crisis, and they had to help the Korean military put the uprising down, and that's what they did. So they supported the generals who conducted the massacre by allowing them to, I mean, this is a joint command, you understand, right? It's a U.S. South Korea joint command. And so troop movements have to be basically approved by both sides. If South Korea moves troops, the U.S. knows about it. The U.S. often, it gives a yes or a no. And the U.S. was actually ready. The Koreans were about to take the city, and then the Korean army asked the U.S. Army, the U.S. military asked the Korean side to hold off on retaking the city until the U.S. could get its assets in place, namely the USS Coral Sea, which is an aircraft carrier, and spy planes from Okinawa, so they can have these, observing the whole area while the suppression of the uprising went on. And that's what happened on May 27th. The Korean troops, backed by this, U.S. forces, rolled in, and they retook the city and took hundreds and hundreds of prisoners. And they, people were thrown in. And none of this, the U.S. tried to deny that it had given, permission, but it was out there. But what actually happened was covered up for years and years. And it actually wasn't until 1996 that I got documents showing about the secret meetings that the Carter administration had at the time that we even knew that, the U.S. had taken this position. Unfortunately, because it's Korea, my stories, didn't get out that much, but they sure got out in Korea. Made a big difference and Ingu in his book mentions my document several times because it had a huge impact on how South Korean activists viewed the United States. Until then, a lot of people thought, well, the U.S. is an ally and we can count on their support when our democracy is threatened. But when that happened in Gwangju, they realized that the U.S. was not on the side of the democracy. I'll send, and if you send me I can send you some links.
Thank you for answering that. And thanks for the question, Al.
Yeah, thank you. And how do I get in touch with Mr. Shorock to get that information?
Tim Shorock at Gmail.
Okay. Thank you. I'll send you an email. Thank you.
And then I'd like to include a question from Tasha. And I asked Mr. Hwang or Tim, feel free to take a stab at this, if whichever, either of you. There is a candlelight movement and hug protest in South Korea to impeach President Yoon. Do you think Yoon will be impeached like Park? I'm presuming this is referring to Park Geun-hye.
Go ahead, Ingu.
Actually, you already commented it could happen.
Yeah, it could happen.
Just historical situation, do not know what would happen, but I actually met several of those who participated in that recent candlelight demonstrations to oppose the policies and some critical problems of the current Yoon government's administration. And so the movement is not consistently developing and solid itself, but many of those people actually are aware of the currently somehow dwindling conditions of democracy, especially about some censorship issues, and especially about the kind of somehow secret kind of line of interventions in our government, and also too much bifurcated, just like political narratives to isolate and exclude a certain group of peoples without any proper reasons. And so the issues actually very much accumulated. And then also a number of people who is aware of this situation is also increasing. That's definitely true. But how that could develop in millions of protests, there should be some contingency factors. And so, yeah, today kind of events could be one of the factors. And so perhaps this part could be done well by Mr. Shorock.
I was there right at the tail end of the candlelight revolution, and when Moon Jae-in was elected, partly on the strength of the candlelight revolution. But that came about because of really serious corruption within the government of Park Geun-hye, and you had this terrible incident where this ferry boat, sank, drowning 300 school kids. And the government incompetence was so glaring, was just so shocking to people. The president was getting her hair done, and there was no communication with the president's office for hours, and it just made people sick but angry, and that really fueled it. And there was other incidents that happened as well. There was extreme corruption, bribery going on, but that incident with the ferry was kind of a turning point. And strangely, it was one of the points of the when they tried to kick her out of office, but she was not found guilty of anything on that particular charge. But it really fueled it. So I think you know, I mean, there's been some incidents with Yoon, but nothing quite as drastic as that thing that happened. So it'll take some kind of drastic action for, you know, something to really, you know, do this again and unseat another ruler. But it's, you know, I think there's a lot of animosity, and I sense that, you know, the conservatives are probably not going to win next time, but it's hard to know with what their unpredictable nature of the conflict with North and South Korea, and then North Korea and the U.S. and so on. It's hard to say.
Thank you both for answering that. And we're running a little bit over time, so I'll just give it one last question, and I'll direct it to Soon-hee, please.
Mine is not actually a question. I would like to say that Hayden will make an announcement later, but I think this time Koreans might need strong international support to overthrow this government. The current government and the elite cartel is really much more corrupt in a way than Park Geun-hye government, but that's not enough right now, because against the U.S. very open support for this government. So I think it could happen by way of protest, international protest against the unprecedented radioactive wastewater dumping to the ocean by Japan and the current South Korean government that approves as strongly. They made a statement in support of that dumping, and it could help. And when Hayden makes an announcement, I'd like you to pay attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I think it's, you know, the Biden support for Yoon is really problematic, in part because his top aides, Blinken and Campbell, who runs the Asia policy, they were both there under Obama when they were very close to Park Geun-hye. You know, in fact, Blinken brokered an agreement on the so-called comfort women between Park Geun-hye and Abe Shinzo in Japan that didn't even include any input from the women who had suffered, the women who had been enslaved by the Japanese. This agreement was completely rejected by the Korean people, and Moon Jae-in government repudiated it. And they had, you know, so then they had to go out. That was going to be the basis for a trilateral agreement earlier, you know, during Obama. So it's the same people, and you can bet that they're talking to the CIA all the time about, you know, how weak is Yoon really, and what's his, you know, how does the threats, you know, match up, and, you know, who is he up against internally in South Korea and all that. But they will not, they will do anything to keep this guy in power, I think, aside from supporting a military coup, which as I said before, I don't think that can happen. But there's, you know, they want this guy for their U.S. strategic interests. And I think that's to me is really a dangerous situation. And something that we as Americans, you know, need to do something about and, you know, talk about. Liberals just love, you know, Biden and his foreign policy. You know, Democrats all the time, you know, oh, it's compares so, you know, like look at Trump, he threw away all our international agreements, et cetera. You know, well, there's empire, and then there's, you know, just brute force. I mean, there's like, I don't think Biden support is going to help, and I think we have to really try to convince Congress and you know, people in power that this is the wrong way to go. Do you agree with that, Ingu?
What you say?
Did you agree with that? I mean, what's your thought?
Yeah, actually, I totally agree with you. And so this is a subject that is again, actually, in the last part of my presentation, I said that redefining the boundaries of issues. And exactly now just democracy is not simply about domestic issues. This is already crossed the areas and transnational subjects, and also not simply subject about the democracy as a procedural issues, very much extended to the social and also the humanity issues. So in the sense, yeah, absolutely true. And then also those who are fully aware of the issue and then need to initiate. And in the sense, again, actually, also you know how to create the momentums, although it's not visibly kind of tangible yet, but it's yeah, the direction is totally sure, and then the content is sure. Yeah.
Thank you both of you for addressing this really important concern. I'm going to have to call time, but I did want to ask Professor Hwang, John Breslin was asking in the chat, how can I access writing by Professor Hwang on this subject? Oh, and I see you've already put your email in the chat. So thank you very much for that. John, was that addressing your question?
Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, thank you very much for asking. I guess with that, since we are running a little bit over time, and I'd like to thank Cole and the Mass Tech and folks that are running tech for bearing with us through this. I wanted to once again thank you both, Professor Hwang and Tim, for being with us tonight. I've learned a lot, and I think for a bit of a hopeful note to close things out, since we were talking about transnational movements and solidarity, I remember when we were protesting President Yoon at Harvard back in April, several labor organizers who we had been in zero communication with just showed up because they had been in contact with labor groups in South Korea. It made them aware of this visit, and they showed up, and together we stood against a lot of the militaristic stuff that Yoon was espousing while he was speaking at Harvard. And that gives me some hope for building these transnational links as we build towards peace in Korea and in Okinawa and in many other places. But thank you.
Glad to hear that.
If, in case you joined late, or in case you'd like to share this presentation or rewatch it, this is being live streamed and recorded on Facebook, and the recording will also be posted on YouTube. So to our audience, if you enjoyed this presentation, share it widely. And I'd like to highlight two events coming up this week. The first is, if you are available tomorrow, our very own Joseph Gerson will be helping to present a report back from the 70th anniversary commemoration in Korea of the 70th anniversary of the Korean War armistice, as well as talks about denuclearization in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it'll be at 7 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, if you care to join. Also, and relevant to what Sung Hee is bringing up, on this Saturday, September 16th, there will be a protest against the Yoon government in relation to its approval of the Fukushima radioactive wastewater dumping in the ocean. So if you're in the greater Boston area, it will be this Saturday, the 16th at 5 p.m. At Harvard Square near the Cambridge Visitor Information Booth. And you can probably see some of our great New England chapter members on the ground there. Just generally speaking, if you'd like to learn more, you can please check out both Engu and Tim's contacts, which they have dropped in the chat. If you would like to get involved with New England Korea Peace Campaign, you can email candlelightactionboston@gmail.com, and that will put you in touch with our chapter. If you'd like to learn more about Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network and some of their work, which touches on many of the things brought up tonight, you can go to their website at koreapeacenow.org. And lastly, and I think relevant to what both Tim and Ingrid brought up about Congress, we are pushing for a bill called the Peace in the Korean Peninsula Act that would commit the United States to supporting a peace treaty to formally end the Korean War. And we're trying to get in contact with all of our members of Congress. On this date, we have one prime sponsor and 34 co-sponsors in the U.S. House of Representatives. and we're working on getting a Senate counterpart. If you want to contact your member of Congress, you can use this email form, which I'm dropping in the chat. Which you can also find this on the Korea Peace Now website. All right, that was a large mouthful for me, but thank you very much to everyone for being here. I hope you have a good night and onwards to peace.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Appreciate it.